All right, and welcome to Chocobo Chasers. We are absolutely thrilled to be welcoming our next guest onto the show, Mike Laidlaw, best known for his work at BioWare as the creative director of the Dragon Age series, as well as the designer and director for the first three games, as well as being part of the writing team as well for the severely underrated Jade Empire. Mike, you are currently at, I believe it's Yellow Brick Games, is that correct?
Absolutely. Yes.
Awesome. Well, I know that you just mentioned right before the show started that you can't necessarily mention too much about what you guys are working on now, but I think it's safe to say that all three of us are extremely, extremely excited for what you guys are working on. So Dash, why don't you go ahead and get us kicked off here, man?
So when it comes to Dragon Age, were there any kind of like particular games or inspirations that you pulled from that? Because like I kind of got that feel from like Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights kind of being in there, and especially with the first game of the series, kind of having that play style before it started focusing on the ARPG. But
Yeah, it got a little more actiony in the later iterations, but Origins in particular, it was interesting. I mean, the game went through a number of sort of I wouldn't say necessarily vision changes, but it took quite a while for the vision to really solidify. It was definitely new IP. It was fantasy. It was being built on its own engine. And one of the challenges of any kind of engine change or engine development in particular is it takes a long time. So you have a long time with ideas, but without them kind of concretely landing into a game. So I think there was a really strong sense of like building on the legacy of the Baldur's Gate games, building on Neverwinter Nights, which had been, of course, like if you play Neverwinter Nights, like the actual ending, it talks about how like, oh, there's something new coming, and kind of hints at it. But I joined the studio, let me think, when Dragon Age was sort of just spinning up because Neverwinter Nights had just shipped. And it went through a lot of, like I said, sort of, I don't want to say convulsions because it never really wasn't what shipped, but I think a lot of sort of directional things in terms of, hey, what exactly should it feel like? And I think it was, and again, I wasn't on the project on Origins in particular when it first landed. At the time, it was being, I think, helmed. The original concept came out of James O'Len, who was, the Baldur's Gate kind of lead designer. Brent Knowles did a fantastic job shepherding it for like another 4 years or so after James went to work on Knights of the Old Republic down in Austin. He moved and kind of helped start that studio. And during that time, Dan Tudge joined as executive producer. And Dan, I think from memory, was the guy who sort of said, I think we just need to be the spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate. That's what we need to be. And I think that really helped kind of cement a lot of the UI decisions, the directional stuff in terms of the way the tactical play with the party and so on played out. And that was something that I always felt was very, it was important to me to keep, though we did suffer, I think, we moved to Frostbite, the tactical camera wasn't as strong as I wanted it to be and stuff. And that was a lot of that was, again, an engine change and the redevelopment that happened. But yeah, for gaming inspiration, I would say it was very much a return to form for fantasy for BioWare, except doing it, with our own IP instead of doing it with the Wizards of the Coast IP.
Yeah. Right. That is awesome. Thank you so much for that. Eric, do you want to
detail on that? Way more detail than I expected. Really, my question is, so you said, I want to be honest with you, I thought you had joined Origins kind of in the beginning. You had went from Jade Empire to Origins, but you went into Origins. At what point did the team really kind of sit down and be like, man, this is going to be very good. This is going to be talked about for years?
I think there was uncertainty for a long time on Origins in particular. I worked on Mass Effect 1 for a while. There was a Jade Empire sequel that never saw the light of day. But when I joined, it was interesting because I got to join in a position where it was finally moving into like its, I guess, later stages of production. The console builds were happening, voiceover was coming in, the cutscenes were being implemented. So as I came in, and I have to give props to, again, Brent and folks like Keith Warner and just so many, like Yaron Jacobs and obviously Dave Gator, fantastic designers, and of course a lot of programmers like Ross Gardner and Dean Anderson, and anyway, it's just so many people, right? How do you credit everyone? I guess you read the credits in the game. That's how. But anyway, that aside, for me, I came in when it was shaping up. There was still a lot of tuning to be done. There was still like the final sort of is this the right call for this voice actor? Is this the right performance? We were in very much in that phase. So it would be in the full, like, I guess, throes of production, as opposed to, like, say, pre-production or conception or finaling. And so I got to play it with reasonably fresh eyes. And I'd had played some earlier builds, but it's never the same if you're not on the team. If you don't really have, skin in the game, like you're playing football or something. So I saw it and played it through. And what had been obvious to me is that, one of the big strengths of the development is, while the engine was being built, the writing team and the level designers actually used Neverwinter Nights to stub in the whole game. So you could run a Neverwinter Nights version of Denerim and a Neverwinter Nights version of Ostagar. And the dialogues were all there, and they built custom tools to basically export out of Neverwinter and put them into the Dragon Age writing tools and stuff. So kind of that we could salvage as much of that work as possible. But it was obvious that that work had paid off, right? That there was a very, very intricately fleshed out game, a game that, like, they did not waste the 6 years of dev in order to make that happen. So I had a feeling it was definitely something special. And there was a real sense of, I guess, feeling somewhat honored to be asked to join in and to kind of shepherd this thing. And then, of course, trying to do right by a sequel and to keep the IP kind of sane so that we could do novels and that kind of stuff too became an interesting challenge for me, because I wanted something like Origins to really get its due. I don't think Dragon Age 2 was the perfect follow-up. I think it was as good as it was going to possibly get on the timeline we had. So I'm very proud of it, but it still was, I think another year sure would have made a difference, But that said, I think Origins was super great. And I think, as it came in together, people could see it. And I think a lot of RPGs are like that. They're a stew. And until all the ingredients are in and it's cooked for a while, and those little adjustments, a little more salt, a bit of paprika, something like that. Until that happens, they're kind of awful to play in the beginning, right? The combat's kind of janky, and the story's got a bunch of bugs. And so you have to squint to see the potential, right? And I think that, to me, any really veteran game designer will tell you that is like being able to sort of, narrow your eyes or put your designer goggles on, we often say, is critical, because you can sort of see the potential in what you have. Because if you look at just what you have, it's despair. It's all, like, games are pretty broken until they aren't. So
That is awesome.
I'm sorry, I'm definitely giving longer answers than you anticipated.
This is absolutely
that's
what we
my
love,
thing.
and this is our listeners are definitely,
you don't have to worry about that. We're loving every second of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Soaking it all up. And so you kind of touched on a little bit of this. So being a part of the writing and creative team, obviously you oversee a lot of what goes on in the back end. And obviously that provides you a pretty unique perspective just in terms of crafting an opinion, whether a game is quote unquote good or bad. And so thinking, I guess, kind of stepping outside the box a little bit, what are some of your favorite games that you don't have a hand in, or maybe games that you can kind of just admire, like from the outside?
Oh, geez. Wow. There are so many. We could go forever.
Hey, just a few examples then.
Let's go. Let's go a classic example. I've mentioned this in other interviews, but I still like to bring it up. I mean, my favorite game is Star Control 2, but like that one really stands out for me. But one that I think is really impressive, alongside it, kind of jockeying in the top spots, is A Mind Forever Voyaging. It's an old school Infocom text parser game, like Go North, Look at Box kind of stuff. It always stood out to me, I think, because it was such a scathing indictment of certain politics during the 80s. And of course, I was, 12. So I didn't know what was happening, but it mechanically was incredible, because you were basically a supercomputer projecting yourself into your own simulation of life 20 years in the future based on a set of economic policy. So it was sort of looking at Reaganomics and that kind of stuff. And so you just wandered around, unlike most, Infocom games where you're like, oh, I have to stop the groove, I have to solve the puzzle. It was more like, no, man, just go to the movies and like hang out with your wife and have dinner. But you were recording it, so you were getting points as you recorded essentially data. You were studying this. It was like future anthropology, and then you start jumping 30 and 40 years ahead, and at 40 years ahead, it was like a disaster. Like everything was awful. So of course the game shifted at that point, and it becomes more like, stop the government from shutting you down because you're delivering the bad news, incredible, mind-blowing game to play in like, I don't know, 88, 87, something like that. And that one's always stuck with me in terms of like a feat of like, it was probably the first game I'd ever played that had like political commentary in it, but definitely one it was more immersive than I think a lot of the Infocom stuff was, which is impressive because most of their stuff was. So like that's a game I deeply respect, right? Because it pushed a genre of game that I had really liked as a child into this like space that made my brain kind of, exploding brain gifs, if you prefer. I'm a GIF guy, which I recognize is wrong, but that's okay. Other games that I deeply, my God, the list is so okay. So like Nier Automata, what an incredible sense of place. Remarkably wacky story, absolutely benefiting from the much stronger gameplay. I tried to play Nier. I really tried, but I bounced off the original. I haven't gone back to the replicant, but
yeah.
I very much want to. But the smoothness and the flow and everything of that game got out of the way and actually made it a joy to play. And then you got this incredible mind-bending story with the multiple endings and that incredible credit sequence, like just astonishing. Like Yoko Taro has all my respect. I mean, Final Fantasy 14, endlessly enthralled by that game because I recognize that I have a draw to narrative games and I like a good story. I like a whole bunch of, I like raiding, not like I'm not hardcore, but I enjoy, it's an 8-person, beat up a big old monster that, is going to summon a tidal wave or something.
Yeah.
Sure. I love that. But for me, I think Shadowbringers was where like 14, like I liked Heaven's Ward a lot. Stormblood, it was fine, but Heaven's Ward or Shadowbringers just made me go, wow, what are they even doing over there? That is phenomenal, right? Just the storytelling behind it was spectacular. And I guess other stuff. Okay, one last super new one, Shadows of Doubt. I've been playing that one recently, and it's a completely proc-gen detective game set in what looks like almost like someone took a Dishonored or something and made an immersive sim, but made it like a super like retro blocky DMake, but incredible for what it achieves because it feels like you've got these procedurally generated cases and you're trying to like, piece together evidence and then hand it in to earn bounties and stuff. But while you're at it, you can like climb through vents and break into people's houses and knock them out and, commit crimes. It's still very, very early days for that game, but what it achieves and what it kind of, I guess, aspires to just makes me go, oh, wow, that's an amazing idea. So yeah. Anyway, there's a smattering.
Yeah, no,
I
those
just
are
think
awesome.
games are great, and
they truly
there's
are.
so many people working so hard. It's hard to pick any one.
That is awesome. Dash, why don't you go ahead and follow that up?
So you might not have had a hand in the decision, but the dialogue wheel can be kind of a divisive subject when it comes to the fan base. Was there any kind of particular reason you took that from Mass Effect and put it in Dragon Age 2 and Inquisition as opposed to like the dialogue trees we had in Origins?
I wouldn't say like there was a particular decision that wasn't driven by essentially the addressable market of players on the consoles, right, was larger, and so there was to some degree a let's call it a suggestion that if we can make things a little more friendly for a controller, because going to dig through a list is very imprecise. I think it's fine. I think it's workable. I think games that do it are phenomenal. But the thing with the controller is you had the flick to a single direction and then you made your choice. I think there is an imprecision that comes with the I guess the paraphrases, the smaller, kind of forms that you see. Though a big part of the decision to kind of make that, I think, more palatable and something we decided to do regardless was to actually give a voice to our main character. And so, I think anyone who has a concern around it and says, I don't like the dialogue wheel, it's like, that's a completely valid point. But I think the mixture of, sort of like, look, this game has to be not console first, but like console parity, I think was the urge. Coupled with the fact that the main character was going to be a voice. So like you didn't have to read the line you were going to say in its entirety. And the paraphrase, I guess one of the benefits we saw and that came out of focus testing. And this wasn't, again, I say this knowing someone somewhere is going to be very upset because how dare, right? Like they just hate the wheel. I get it. It's fine. It's okay to hate the wheel. But the thing is, reading this, and this was coming out of focus testing. So again, for a segment of the population, reading the thing you were about to say in its entirety and then clicking it and then hearing the thing you're about to say in its entirety in another voice was actually kind of dissonant, right? Because you'd read it in your head voice. And so that was where I think in large part the idea of a paraphrase, that like this represents what you will say, and then you actually say something that's almost like a continuation of that initial thought or directional kind of snippet, seemed to read well, and the paraphrases fit well within that UI. So combined, it seemed pretty workable. It was not, wildly disliked in Mass Effect 1, but I recognized, and I mean, I knew it's not something you go into and go, well, we're going to make this choice, I'm sure everyone will love it. Change is disruptive, and I think there are people who prefer the silent protagonist just in general, and they prefer, I want to read exactly what I want to say. And there's even a strength to that comes out of it in terms of what Luke Christensen, a co-writer of mine, who's my co-lead on Jade Empire, he wrote a significant portion of BG1. He'd been at BioWare basically since the first year. Genius guy, absolute genius. And so Luke would say, see, the thing that people don't realize is when you pop up that list of choices, people read all the choices, or tend to, if they care. They might just press A and skip, or press, left click. But he said they tend to read the choices, and you actually sort of get this, you can almost drop reminders of the subject, like, oh yeah, you only mentioned this part and this part, but the player kind of gets this complete understanding of, by reading those full phrases, and goes, right, yeah, that's what this guy's talking about. So there were tricks that could be used to turn those full phrases into a really powerful reminder of contextual, I guess, understanding of what could be said. That said, there's a counter argument that there is nothing hidden behind those phrases. When you click them, that's exactly what your character says. You know all the things your character could have said, and there's no surprise on a second playthrough where you snark at someone, or there's a funny one-liner behind some sort of, purple hawk option if you use Dragon Age 2. So, you win some, you lose some, but I think it was the right call for DA2 in the circumstances DA2 found itself in for Inquisition as well. And I think it works better with a voice protagonist than it does with a silent one.
Yes.
But
I don't think many people look at it from that perspective either.
Sure. But the thing is, you could also, here's the thing, it's not like I'm saying, well, if it's a voice protagonist, it must be Will. I don't disagree with that too. I think it was even, sorry, we're going deep.
No,
but
you're
but
fine.
Here's the thing: if you look at, say, what Deus Ex does, right, habitually, both the original and going forward into the Human Revolution and stuff. Yeah, that wasn't the first one. Human Revolution was 2. What was the first one of the remakes? Anyway, brain.
Yeah.
What they do is you read a line, you say that line, and then JC or Adam or whoever continues, right, and has something else to say. So that was a line that actually indicated a direction for them, like a small paragraph, which I think is another right way to have kind of a surprise despite voiceover, despite full text. And I think that's a very strong way to present it. So, there's tons of great ways to do this.
Definitely. Eric, why don't you go next, man?
You find yourself the protagonist in a Dragon Age game. You can bring 3 companions on your quest. Which 3 are you choosing?
Wow, that's a tough one.
Why is one Iron Bull?
Well, here's the thing. So it's not tough because, who would I pick? It's tough because there are 2, to me, really distinct and entertaining groups to bring with. I think that the Bull Dorian Solus mixture is just absolutely fantastic, right? Because Bull has just amazing kind of banter with those 2 in particular. Dorian, in fact, because they might be quietly falling in love with one another, and they probably would in my case, because cool, enjoy. But Solus, of course, with Bull, Solus quite quickly sees that Bull is much smarter than Bull lets on, right? Bull deliberately throws up a facade of big drunk lout, and he is actually very clever. So next thing you know, they're playing chess in their head. So I think that's good. It's also a pretty workable sort of, presuming, I guess I'm a rogue, but like, a couple mages and a big hefty tank with probably 2-hander is fantastic. I think, there's also an argument to be made for going with like OG Murder Squad, right? Like get Liliana, Morrigan, and maybe Alistair, because you need a good tank in there. You know, but like I love Liliana and Morgan as characters. I think they're both fantastic, and they both grow and change a lot through the series. And I think they also benefit sharply from their interplay with one another. They do not agree on fundamental things, but both of them are kind of deeply pragmatic in a way neither one of them wants to admit. And I think Morgan kind of wishes she was a little more Liliana, and Liliana wishes she was a little more Morgan. And I think depending on how you play, they can actually slide along that spectrum, which is cool and interesting.
Oh yeah.
Dash, you want to go next?
So over the course, there's a number of projects that you were working on that got canceled. The Jade Empire sequel, the original Dragon Age 4, and there's the Ubisoft project called Avalon that had to do with like Knights of the Round Table.
Like allegedly. Allegedly.
How common is that in the game industry?
I think it's a lot more common than people realize. I don't think there was a culture of sort of the, let's call it the stronger, we could call it Schreier-esque, if you will, like investigative journalism, right? Where people were digging and trying to figure out what happened behind whatever events occurred. It's something where I think a lot of devs, and a lot that I know and work with even now, have a lot of like, you know, ones that got away that, oh, that would have been so cool, especially if it gets shut down the early days. You're always sort of like blue sky potential brainstorming, like we could do this and it would be awesome. And that is, if you hear the premise of almost any game is canceled, you're like, oh, that sounds super cool. But at the same time, like between here's a high level concept and here's a thing on the shelves, there's 3 years of like hard decisions, right? And real labor and investment and time and market and so many factors. You know, a particular will at a particular publisher, or a particular, you know, creative directional change, a market shift, a pandemic hits, you know, whatever. That kind of stuff can leave a lot of you know, tape on the cutting room floor. And so, yeah, I think it's sadly common that a lot of people have canceled projects on. I think it's probably a necessity of a creative industry. Maybe, you know, I don't think every idea it works. I don't think everything that I've seen should have necessarily gone forward, or even things I've been on in the environment they were in, because they wouldn't have survived sort of the external pressures, right? And it'd be, you know, you're only built for deep sea vents. You can't swim that far because it gets too cold, you know. You were only perfect for this year, you know. So that kind of thing can happen. And it does leave, in a lot of ways, I think the legacy of those games, though, is you have a bunch of really creative people who have had to, you know, adjust to, oh, well, I'm not working on this anymore, but there was this one thing I really liked, and I kind of want to bring that with me, or I have an idea I want to, and it's never really recycling. It's more of like, it's almost like composing music, right? You know, it's sort of like you're still playing with the same instruments or the same orchestra. So you might look at a flourish you really enjoyed and never really got to use in one thing and go, it's perfect here. It's still a very different piece. It's very different mood. It's very different, you know, sort of orchestral composition. So it's not the same thing, but it might rhyme with the original thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
How far do you get into those development processes when sometimes these do get canceled? Is it kind of just still in the draw up phases, or does it get to the point where you're actually trying to lay down the groundwork at that point?
It depends. I think it's reasonably rare that you see something get canceled that's like full steam into production, in large part because a lot of publishers or development groups or studios have usually enough gates or enough sort of approval processes that have to be passed in order for you to get to full steam production. Like, oh man, there's 100 people on this, or, you know, if it's like an Assassin's Creed, you're talking like 1,000 people working on it at a time and stuff. So that kind of thing, I would say, is reasonably rare, in part because, you know, there is always the sunk cost kind of. Sometimes it's a fallacy, like, oh, you really should cut and run, but when you've invested that much time and effort into getting something all the way to production, it's usually sometimes worth seeing if there is magic in there, right? Could we catch some lightning in this bottle, even if we're a little worried about it? So it tends towards the earlier phases, right? What I think of as conception or pre-production. But it's a wacky industry and everybody's got war stories, right? You know, I'm sure there's games that had very playable demos that were very promising, but just a contract fell through and hey, we don't have this anymore, so we literally can't make this game. Could we retool it? No, I don't think it's worth it. You know, so yeah, it's a complicated industry and there's just 1,000 moving parts and a lot of money being flung around.
So you mentioned earlier in the show that Star Control 2 is your favorite game. I've read that you're also a huge fan of, you know, Wasteland, Neuromancer. So growing up and playing those, did it ever make you think growing up, hey, I want to be a part of this, like as your career? Or I guess how did that kind of trajectory work, like going into college where you're like, yeah, I want to be a video game designer? Or, you know, what did that process look like?
I wanted in. That looked awesome. I wanted to land something in games. So I mean, trajectory wise, there was a lot of you know, in the old days, you used to be able to buy like magazines that you would like enter code in and it'd be like, cool, you just made a BB. I remember one was like, it took like 6 months. You had to buy 6 months of magazine, but you could have a functional BBS, a bulletin board system people could like phone into and stuff that you coded yourself. Mostly you just copied and typed in what was in the book. Because we couldn't scan and then turn that into text, you know, in 86. It was unheard of magic, right? That was like Star Trek. So I mean, I was into that. I mean, I was a little bit self-taught in terms of programming, not much, but like I got to the point where I was using very early day C, but Pascal was probably the first like object-oriented thing that I had taught myself, which turned out to be really handy because it was enough of a foundation that when I got to the Neverwinter Nights tool set, which I had to build like a module using logic and like plot scripting and stuff, and submit it for my job at BioWare. And I was able to use I was like, oh, okay, this is like those things that I used to use back in the day. So that was fortuitous, serendipitous, perhaps. But yeah, I remember one of the first games I ever got was a Load Runner on cartridge. And you were a little guy who basically you had to collect treasures from like, I don't know, you're being hunted by robots. Games were simple back then. You had to collect treasures from these like side-scrolling maps, but the thing you could do was dig a hole behind you so guys would like fall in and then they would be crushed and they would respawn. But it was kind of like eating the ghosts, you know. It was like kind of hard to do, but you could make paths and fall through yourself and stuff too. You could totally crush yourself if you were bad at it too. But it had a level editor. And so like, you know, I'm 8 with my Commodore 64, desperately asking my dad for a 1541 5.25-inch floppy disk drive so I could save my levels. And I think that was a pretty early indicator that, and I'm not a good level designer by any means, but at least I wanted to create in that space. I thought it was fascinating. And I grew up in a farm, but my parents were wildly indulgent and completely willing to support that fascination with technology. So, yeah, so I kept at it, and going to university was, I think at that point I decided I wanted to do writing. I didn't really feel like I had a head for deep coding or anything like that. And I quite enjoyed creative writing and stuff. So I went hard for all my high school classes into like, there were only 3 or 4 kind of, Ontario had this quasi grade 13 thing, but you could take it as pre-entrance stuff for university. So I took all 3 Englishes and then some others, but the Englishes were the big ones. And that got me in at University of Western. And there I was very lucky. There was a professor named Professor Redekop, who I quite enjoyed. Fantastic guy. And he would consistently do science fiction and fantasy classes and like really dig in on the literature and the values of, I did one that was on like on Dune, all 6 books, and comparing and contrasting it with Dan Simmons' Hyperion and Nemean quadrilogy. Like, okay, that's an amazing class. I'm going to take that. But yeah, he would do deep dives in Lord of the Rings. And I also paired that with a lot of medieval literature, right? So reading Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the original Middle English, and kind of learning how to bend the will and other weird constructions, and having to look at the footnotes and going, well, what does that mean? Oh, it means a good night. Got it. So yeah, I did a lot of medieval, I did a lot of sci-fi, I did a lot of stuff that kind of I felt would bend me towards the more creative side of like English language and literature, and that I guess paid off.
Awesome. Eric, do you want to follow it up with our final question here?
Yeah. So you've kind of been at the pinnacle of RPGs in your career. If there's another genre you could dip your toes into, what would you like to do?
I mean, I'm intrigued by taking some of the precepts of RPG in terms of reactivity and sort of deep characterization, and then looking a little more for me in the action space is quite intriguing. So I mean, you know, Nier is an intriguing game to me because I play it and I go, oh man, that's really cool. Dragon's Dogma is one of my all-time favorites because it does stuff that basically no other game does, and I go, wow, that's a really interesting twist. And what it kind of does is it, you know, you could argue Fable is there too, where not Fable 3. Fable 3 actually leaned very heavily into what I call dilemma in terms of design. So well, the Bioware games definitely use this for quite a bit for like mass and stuff. Do you save the Arachnite Queen? Do you murder the Arachnite Queen? Obviously, everything in Telltale's library is very dilemma focused, right? Do you save Judy or Frank, right? The zombies, you know, and you're like, oh man, I got to make a call, right? And then you see that play out. And I love that. And I think it's super cool. I guess I've worked with dilemma for so long. There's a part of me, it's like, what if we went a little more action and said, like, let's just focus on the character interactions around like more around the play instead of around the choice. That to me is something I would love to dig into. I think while if I had to pick one other, sorry, every answer gives
No,
you two
hey,
answers. I'm
you're
so
totally
sorry.
fine.
But
This is
if I had to
perfect.
pick another, I have a fascination with like colony builder games, and I don't know that I actually have the skill set to build them, but that kind of emergent storytelling that comes out of Dwarf Fortress, RimWorld, Strand Alien Dawn, or even a city builder like Banished, you know, games like that to me are just so fascinating. I don't really necessarily have the experience that I think would really be most valuable there, but at some point I wouldn't even mind joining like a studio working one of those in sort of a more junior role and just sort of like soaking up the knowledge of how like that balance and how you do that. I think it was just some incredible experiences in which the player is engaged as part of the storyteller, right? And where purely systems driven stuff still creates a very emergent narrative. And I mean, obviously, I think RimWorld's probably the king game of this, whereas Dwarf Fortress is the king simulator of this, if you take my meaning, right? One's a little more designed to deliver fun on certain parameters, like, this storyteller will definitely keep you on your toes, whereas Dwarf Fortress is sort of like, I don't know, did you settle near a necromancer? Good fucking luck.
Mike, thank you. This has been, I know that you like apologize for your long answers, but this is exactly what like we love. One is
Cool.
gamers, and then I think our audience also enjoys like really getting a cool behind the scenes look at you know, kind of your process and really your ideals like when it comes to gaming. So this has been absolutely awesome. We want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And I think with that, I think we're all set to kind of wrap things up here. So again, Mike, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll go ahead and we'll call this.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for
Thank you so
coming on.
much.